Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Trinity Lutheran Church. My name is Jared Orsi. I am the president of the board of directors of the Theologian in Residence program, which is the nonprofit theology organization that is sponsoring tonight's events. And I'm really glad to see you all out here. I see a lot of familiar and friendly faces and also some new faces. It's really exciting for me to be here at Trinity. The event tonight is titled Reformation or Revolution, and we're going to be looking at the Second Vatican Council, which the Catholic Church celebrates the 50th anniversary of this month. And we're going to put it right next to the Protestant Reformations, plural, I said, the Lutheran Church here at Trinity celebrated Reformation Sunday this past Sunday. So we have a good constellation of historical events coming together here tonight. This has been the event of all of the events in the Vatican II series that the Theologian in Residence program has been sponsoring this fall. This is the event that for me personally has been the most fun to work on. Part of it is because I've gotten to work with these four wonderful panelists here. But also it's been fun for me because I feel like we're doing ecumenism, which the spirit of Vatican II called us to do. And this was an opportunity for people of different Christian denominations to come together and find their common ground and exchange ideas. And it's been just a joy for me to participate in so far. And I'm very excited about the panel that we have for you this evening. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to say some thank yous and make some announcements. First of all, the next event in TIR's fall Second Vatican Council series will be on November 13th, and we're very excited to welcome the nationally known journalist E.J. Diane, who will be coming to Fort Collins. You might know him from syndicated posts from columns from the Washington Post, or from hearing him on NPR or seeing him on TV on MSNBC. And he's going to be speaking on campus at Colorado State University on November 13th at 7 p.m. And we are selling tickets out there for that event in the hall. So if you'd like to pick up one of your tickets for that event, please do so on your way out. I'd also like to say some thank yous. First of all, to Pastor Meghan and Pastor Gabby and the entire community here at Trinity Lutheran for opening up your house of worship to this event this evening. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Sharon Johnston for organizing a wonderful reception out there beforehand. I'd like to thank the board members of the Theologian in Residence program who have put many hours into organizing this and our other events this evening, and without whom none of us would be able to be here this evening. I'd also like to say a thank you to our financial sponsors, of whom there are many of you in the audience here tonight. I won't name everybody, but they are listed on the back of your program, and we are very grateful for the financial support that has made this series and this evening tonight possible. The plan for this evening is to juxtapose the Second Vatican Council and the Protestant Reformations and see if we learn anything. And to lead us in that effort, we have four distinguished speakers, and I'll introduce them right now at the beginning, and then they will proceed in turn through the program. Immediately to my left here is Dr. Joachim Viens. Joachim is the theologian, the director emeritus of the Theologian in Residence program, and a long-time intellectual alike, both in Christian faith communities in northern Colorado, as well as on the campus at Colorado State University. To his left is Rebecca McFee, who is one of the pastors at First United Methodist Church here in Fort Collins. And to her left, many of you will see the familiar face there, Meghan Aelabouni, who is the CoPastor here at Trinity. And finally, we have Diane Margolf, who is the chair of the history department at Colorado State University and a specialist in early modern European history, especially the history of France and religious history. And the plan for the evening is for Diane to speak first. She's going to give a talk for about half an hour. She's going to give us a historical overview on the history of the Protestant Reformations of the 16th century, and in particular what the latest scholarship, historical scholarship, is telling us about those events. Then we're going to have Rebecca and then Meghan and Joachim speak in turn for about 12 to 15 minutes each, offering response and a personal witness or reflection on their experience of being Vatican II pastoral and theological leaders in our own era. And then finally, I'm going to put the question to each one of them, and they have to talk in a soundbite here. They get about 1 minute for this. I want them to respond to us. The question, was Vatican II a modern Reformation? And I think you'll hear 4 very different answers on that. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We'll let the panelists talk to each other, let you talk to them, and see where the evening goes. So I'm excited for this, and thank you all for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Diane now.
Okay, the risk is sounding like a Verizon commercial. Can you hear me? Does this work? Okay. Well, first of all, let me say thank you to you for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. It's an honor to be part of this series, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you. And I may say to be here as a historian and not as department chair. It's a change and a welcome one. Since I first spoke with Jared about the possibility of giving this talk this evening, way back in August, I have felt less like a department chair and less like a professor and more like a student. And so my assignment for this evening, as I understand it, is threefold. First, it is to talk about the Protestant Reformation as a historical phenomenon, as a set of events that occurred in 16th century Europe having to do with religion and many other things. Second, I'm to talk about the Protestant Reformation and how it has been studied and interpreted by historians, and in particular, how historians have reinterpreted the Reformation within the past 50 or 60 years. Third, I will try to suggest some possible connections between the Protestant Reformation and the main topic of this lecture series, which is the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church, which occurred between 1962 and 1965. Now, I must admit that events in the 20th century seem like terra incognita to a historian of the 16th century like myself. But I will hope to draw upon some of the insights offered by our previous speaker, Dr. John O'Malley, regarding Vatican II and its historical context. And finally, I hope that my remarks will help to set the stage for the reflections by my fellow speakers here tonight and for our discussion with all of you. Let me begin with a very brief version of what I will call the standard narrative of the Protestant Reformation. It goes something like this. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther went to the door of the cathedral in Wittenberg, Saxony, where he preached and taught at the city's university. Angered by the selling of indulgences, Luther had written 95 theses or propositions challenging the validity of this practice. He nailed this document to the cathedral door, and thus began the Protestant Reformation. Luther quickly got into trouble with both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the ruler of the towns and provinces of Germany at this time, including Saxony, for his preaching and teaching about Scripture, the sacraments, and corruption among the clergy, including the Pope. But his ideas spread through Germany and the rest of Europe, inspiring other leaders of the Protestant Reformation, such as John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli. Alarmed at this fragmentation of Christian unity and rebellion against its authority and traditions, the Roman Catholic Church responded with a counter-reformation, a kind of counterpunch to the Protestant reformers and their followers. The highlights of this counter-reformation included the Council of Trent and the establishment of new religious orders, notably the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Kings, princes, magistrates, and nobles also took sides in this religious conflict. Sometimes religious differences were used to justify resistance to one's overlord, and sometimes rulers fought to impose religious conformity on their subjects. After more than a century of rebellions, executions, martyrdoms, and warfare, the confessional boundaries hardened across Western Europe and within European states. Political leaders eventually developed other justifications besides religion to explain their alliances, rivalries, and wars, and by the 18th century, enlightened people tended to reject this heritage of conflict and bloodshed in favor of tolerance and the pursuit of natural philosophy. Among historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries, this history was often recounted through a confessional lens. Protestant historians tended to celebrate the Protestant Reformers' heroic break with the medieval corruption and error in the Catholic Church, while Catholic historians tended to deplore the Protestant Reformers' errors in rejecting centuries of Christian tradition and sowing violence and dissent. Still other historians emphasized the rise of the modern individual and the modern nation-state as the most important consequences of these conflicts over religion. Now, this standard narrative of the Protestant Reformation, as I have briefly outlined it here, comprises several important features. First, this is a narrative that focuses on the leaders of the Protestant Reformation. Theologians such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, and monarchs such as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, tend to dominate the story, which in turn revolves around their ideas, words, and actions as recorded in historical sources by or about them. Not surprisingly, this narrative also tends to emphasize the theological issues and debates among the Protestant reformers and between them and their Catholic opponents. The Protestant Reformation's political side is also featured in this standard narrative, including the role of political leaders and elites in supporting, opposing, or simply using these religious conflicts for their own ends. Indeed, in the case of 16th century France, the case I'm most familiar with, it used to be argued in the not-too-distant past that the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants was simply a mask for the political rivalries among French nobles who were jockeying for control over the monarchy and for predominance over each other. If we move away from these elements of the standard narrative, however, the history of the Protestant Reformation becomes a much more complicated story. Such a movement away has, in fact, occurred among historians in the past 50 or 60 years. Since the 1960s and 1970s, changes in the study of history have generated new research and new approaches to understanding the Protestant Reformation, the history I've just described. The advent of social and cultural history led scholars to ask different questions about how the Protestant Reformation developed and who was active in it. While leaders such as Martin Luther and John Calvin have remained important, historians began to investigate the social relationships that were often at the heart of religious change as it occurred in families, villages, towns, cities, and among individuals during the 16th century. A central question in this scholarship concerned how the Reformation was received by individuals in social, economic, and political context. In other words, by ordinary men and women in their local communities. Pursuing this question meant analyzing the kinds of sources that might illuminate the experiences of ordinary people. Historians often adopted the research methodologies of other disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, psychology, and literary criticism, to analyze such sources. Pamphlets, broadsheets with visual images and not just texts, rituals, catechisms, and music. Even the records of institutions that investigated and punished religious dissent, such as the Spanish Inquisition, the Geneva Consistory, and England's church courts, could be mined for insights into the lives, beliefs, and behaviors of those who were summoned to appear before them. Over time, the results of this research have introduced new elements into the standard narrative of the Protestant Reformation, producing a rather different story about society, politics, and religious reform in the 16th century. A revised narrative of the Protestant Reformation, therefore, reflecting these new directions in historical scholarship and methodology, can still begin with Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517. But Luther's call to reform the church, that is, to change it for the better, and to do so by eliminating relatively recent errors and correcting abuses, so that the church would regain its original simplicity and purity, was not necessarily new or modern. Efforts to reform the church, or specific parts of it, were part of Christian tradition. Many of the things Luther criticized or advocated also had antecedents in the writings of late medieval reformers, such as Jan Hus and John Wycliffe. On the other hand, the ideas contained in Luther's lectures, sermons, and pamphlets took on special significance because of the historical context in which they occurred. His pamphlets from the early 1520s, which were written in German, vernacular language, and produced with that relatively new technological marvel, the printing press, included phrases like justification by faith alone and the priesthood of all believers. They reflected Luther's own very personal, very intense struggle to understand Christian theology and to practice the Christian faith. They also reflected his awareness of contemporary scholarship, and his scholarship in his own day, about the Bible. Renaissance humanists such as Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch scholar, were applying new techniques of linguistic and textual analysis to the Christian scriptures. As the Bible's words were being retranslated, their meanings were also being debated. The Bible remained for Luther the touchstone for understanding Christian belief and practice, but he raised important questions about the church's role as the sole authoritative interpreter of this text for lay people. Surely, he argued, all Christian believers should be able to read and understand Scripture for themselves. Luther's interpretation of Scripture and theology, his challenges to papal authority, and concern for, quote, the simple folk, that is, the ordinary Christian believer, combined to produce a call for religious reform that also affected politics and society in 16th century Europe. After all, Luther demanded that secular authorities, that is, the emperor, princes, and nobles who ruled in Germany, should take up the task of reforming the church if popes, clerics, and councils were unwilling or unable to do so. But in 1521, Luther was excommunicated by Pope Leo X and then outlawed by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The protection of the local ruler of Saxony alone enabled Luther to survive and to continue to write. Eventually, he was able to come out of hiding and resumed living and working openly in Wittenberg, where he died in 1546. By that time, Luther's call for reform had become a revolution, a thoroughgoing change in Christian beliefs, practices, and institutions that produced separate Christian churches, confessions, and communities. By the time of Luther's death, Lutheranism had been adopted and established in many parts of Germany, as well as in Scandinavia and parts of Central Europe. Also by the time of Luther's death, a second generation of religious reformers had taken up his ideas and elaborated on them, in some cases taking them in directions Luther neither approved nor supported. Thomas Müntzer, Huldrych Zwingli, and John Calvin were among these. In 1525, for example, Thomas Müntzer led German peasants in open rebellion against their noble and clerical overlords, drawing upon Luther's teachings about Christian community and the priesthood of all believers to call for social and political redress of grievances. Luther himself condemned their actions, and the War of the Common Man, also sometimes called the German Peasants' Rebellion of 1524-26, was brutally suppressed. John Calvin, on the other hand, led the city of Geneva to become a model godly community according to his interpretation of church discipline, scripture, and Christian doctrine. Calvin's major work, The Institutes of Christian Religion, offered a comprehensive account of that interpretation, perhaps reflecting his early training as a lawyer. The Calvinists were Reformed churches, as they came to be called, and communities sprang up not only in Geneva but in France, parts of Germany, the Netherlands, England, and Scotland. And this spread of Calvinism was largely due to the efforts of pastors who received their religious training in Geneva. By the middle of the 16th century, then, the Protestant Reformation had begun to look like a revolution, and not just because of Luther, but because it was spreading and taking on new leaders as well. But historians have also reinterpreted the efforts of Catholic reformers, presenting their efforts as a corollary to the movements led by Luther and Calvin and others. The work of Erasmus in this context has already been mentioned. A contemporary of Luther's, Erasmus was merciless in his criticism of clerical abuses, notably in his satirical treatise, The Praise of Folly, which appeared in 1549. Yet Erasmus stopped short of breaking away from the Church's authority and traditions, and he refused to share or support some of Luther's interpretations of Scripture and theology. Similarly, Cardinal Gasparo Contarini, a Venetian humanist and diplomat, wrote extensively on the need for reform in the Church. Contarini's treatise on the office of bishop, written in 1516, just the year before Luther posted the 95 Theses on the door of the Nuremberg Cathedral, anticipated many of the Council of Trent's decrees about the proper fulfillment of the bishop's office. And Contarini's religious views also paralleled Luther's. Yet Contarini continued to believe that the Church's improvement must come from within. The common ground between Protestant and Catholic reformers' arguments has led historians, more recently, to talk about the religious reformations of the 16th century. And the Counter-Reformation is now more often described as the Catholic Reformation, and they are seen as two sides of the same reforming impulse. The political side of the religious reform movements of the 16th century has continued to engage historians' interest, but changes have occurred in how this topic is treated as well. In the standard narrative, the emphasis was on the actions and decisions of political elites, kings, sometimes queens, rulers, nobles, magistrates, urban elites, the political elites who had the power and the authority to enact political change. More recently, the emphasis has shifted to understanding continuity and change, reception and resistance at the local level. This is in some ways a logical consequence of the standard narrative, which is full of examples of European states that ended up with religious diversity, religious pluralism, rather than uniformity. For example, in the Holy Roman Empire, some German principalities and towns within the larger polity became Protestant, Lutheran, and later Calvinist, while others remained Catholic. Emperor Charles V failed in his desire and his military campaigns to eliminate Protestantism from his realm. In 1555, just prior to his death, the Peace of Augsburg gave legal recognition to Catholics and Lutherans based on the religious affiliation of the local prince or municipal authorities. In France, to take another example, Protestants formed a significant minority within a kingdom that was predominantly Catholic. In France, the Calvinists become the Protestant communities that are most evident in this religious minority. During the second half of the 16th century, Calvinists and Catholics fought against each other and against the French monarchy, which attempted unsuccessfully to command the obedience of both groups. Only in 1598, after decades of bloodshed and a contested succession to the French throne, was King Henry IV able to issue a royal edict proclaiming that his Catholic and Protestant subjects would henceforth forget their past grievances and live in peace with each other. Henry IV, during the Wars of Religion, had been the French Protestants' military and political leader, but he converted to Catholicism shortly after becoming king. In the Edict of Nantes of 1598, he promised his Protestant subjects that he would use his royal authority to protect their position in Catholic France. And finally, in England, many Protestants anticipated that Protestant religious reforms would follow quickly in the wake of King Henry VIII's rejection of papal authority in the very complicated matter of his divorce. A stream of parliamentary statutes in the 1530s made the king the head of the church in England, but both Protestants and Catholics were dissatisfied with religious policy under Henry VIII, and both groups faced suppression for their opposition to his policies during his reign. After his death in 1547, Henry VIII's heirs took religious policy in England from one end of the spectrum to the other. His son, Edward VI, actively pursued Protestant reforms during his 6-year reign from 1547 to 1553, while his half-sister Mary, the next ruler of England, actively sought to restore Catholicism and to return England to the fold of the Roman Catholic Church during her equally short reign, 6 years, from 1553 to 1558. The last of Henry VIII's children, Elizabeth I, who, as you probably know, reigned a lot longer than 6 years, worked with Parliament to enact a compromise early in her reign, which established a moderate Protestantism in the Church of England, but which also left her Catholic and more avidly Calvinist subjects discontented. Until her death in 1603, Elizabeth I governed in the shadow of religious tensions that would surface very quickly during the reigns of her successors in the 17th century. In all three of these examples, in the Holy Roman Empire, in France, and in England, the political and social results of the Reformations had to be worked out at the local level, and often in response to initiatives, laws, and policies from the central governments and the political elites of those states. In order to study the social and political dimensions of the Reformations on the ground, as it were, at the local level, social historians have especially sought sources about the ordinary people who lived in those communities and their role in these events. To illustrate this phenomenon of seeking out the ordinary people and the sources about them, or in some cases, the sources by them, let me introduce two of the newer voices that have been added to the history of the religious reformations of the 16th century. The first is Jeanne de Jussy, a woman who was born outside Geneva in 1503. At the age of 18, she entered the convent of Poor Clares, which was located within Geneva's walls. 14 years later, in August 1535, she and most of the other nuns left Geneva and re-established their community in Annecy with the support from the Duke of Savoy. Jeanne de Jussy's written account of the events leading up to the nuns' departure, which is known as the Short Chronicle, tells the story of the Protestant Reformation in Geneva, but from the perspective of a Catholic nun who was absolutely appalled at what she saw as the spread of heresy in the city. With the historian's gift of hindsight, we know that the Genevans who supported John Calvin's program of religious reform will win the day. But to Jeanne de Jussy, the battle between Geneva's Protestants and Catholics had no foregone conclusion. According to her account, interestingly, women played an active role in this battle, which was often waged with violence, both verbal and physical. Jussy often relishes describing her convent's resistance to attempts at both persuasion and intimidation, since it's frequently attempted to get them to become Calvinist. According to Jeanne de Jussy's account, yet Jussy also interprets and understands events in Geneva as part of a spiritual conflict between good and evil. It's not just about what's happening in Geneva or Europe more generally. There is a specifically religious component to this. As Carrie F. Klaus, the most recent translator and editor of the Short Chronicle, writes, quote, Jeanne de Jussy writes of a world in which, despite the horrific acts of violence going on all around her, things make sense. She never doubts God's complete control of events, whether or not they can yet put all of the pieces together, and the Short Chronicle is surely an attempt to do just that. Jussy and her sisters in the convent of St. Clair are protagonists in a story with a plot, and their experiences are meaningful in it, unquote. Two manuscript versions of the Short Chronicle were used in the convent of the Poor Clares at Annecy, and various editions of this work were published between the 17th and the 19th centuries. But the first English translation of Jussy's work appeared in 2006, published by the University of Chicago Press as part of its series, The Other Voice in Early Modern Europe, which features works by and about women in early modern Europe. Jussy's voice has thus become one of those other voices that is now part of the history of the Protestant Reformation. And the fact that this book is now translated in English and available in paperback means that I can sometimes assign it to my students. My second example of a new voice in and perspective on the history of the Protestant Reformation comes from England. The story of the English Reformation, as I mentioned earlier, often features King Henry VIII's matrimonial woes, not to mention his worries about securing the succession to the throne with a male heir, as well as the dizzying changes in religious policies under the Tudor monarchs who came after him. But the story of the English Reformation is very different when told by Christopher Trickey, the local priest in the tiny village of Morbath for 50 years. Like many such clerics, Trickey kept detailed accounts of his parish's income and expenses, but he also included his own comments about his parishioners, their activities, and his own opinions about village life among the financial records, thus providing an invaluable record of the life of the 33 families who lived in Morbath for the period 1520 to 1574. Trickey's life as a village priest and the village's life, as recounted by him, coincided with many of the most dramatic events of the English Reformation. Yet Morbath's experience of the Reformation often emerges in very undramatic ways, through changes in alms and donations to maintain church buildings, and through the prohibition, and then the restoration, and then the prohibition of traditional prayers and processions. For historian Eamon Duffy, The Voices of Morbath, his book-length study of Trickey's voluminous parish accounts and lively comments, tells the story of, quote, ordinary people in an unimportant place whose claim to fame is that they lived through the most decisive revolution in English history and had a priest who wrote everything down, unquote. But Trickey's story also belongs to a broader reinterpretation of the English Reformation, one that has been provided in part in Duffy's other work. In this broader reinterpretation, what is emphasized is the impact of the English Reformation on communities like Morbath, on ordinary people, and not just on the story of politics at the royal court. But what in the end does any of this have to do with the Second Vatican Council? Drawing upon the lecture given by Dr. John O'Malley comparing the Council of Trent and the Second Vatican Council, which I hope some of you had a chance to hear, I would like to suggest 3 points of comparison, or of comparative reflection. The first point concerns the topic that he raised about issues of authority, and especially the relationship between center and periphery. The religious reformations of the 16th century in Europe clearly involved debates about authority of all kinds. The authority of tradition, the authority of scripture, the authority of popes and the authority of councils, the authority of the lay people and the authority of the clergy, the authority of central governments, secular authorities, and the authority of the power of local communities. Perhaps into this mix, with reference to the Second Vatican Council, we can also consider the authority of conscience. Historians of the Reformation have found it very difficult to come up with all-encompassing social explanations for why people in the 16th century made the religious choices they did. Why some remained Catholic, why some became Lutheran, Calvinist, and a Baptist, or something else. And so at some level, perhaps, the role of the individual and the authority of individual conscience, as well as community, is now being reflected in the scholarship on the 16th century and offers a point of comparison with the Second Vatican Council and its impact. My second point of possible reflection and comparison concerns the problems involved in developing thoughtful, accurate interpretations, thoughtful, accurate histories of Vatican II and the Protestant Reformation. Here again, Dr. O'Malley noted that the complexity of events, along with gaps in the sources, lack of all the historical evidence we would want, and we historians never have enough evidence. All of this can hinder historians' ability to achieve the kind of full understanding that we would like to have, whether it's about the Protestant Reformation or Vatican II. In addition, we historians often approach the study of such events with our own hopes, fears, expectations, and suppositions, which can sometimes interfere with our ability to analyze and appreciate historical events on their own terms. Another historian who has provided a very interesting study of martyrdom in the 16th century has made this argument that it's impossible to understand the meaning of martyrdom among Catholics, Protestants, and Anabaptists in 16th century Europe if we look at it through the lens of our own views about giving up one's life for one's religious convictions. Instead, this historian, Brad Gregory, has argued we have to try to understand what martyrdom meant to the people who witnessed it and who went through it in the 16th century. Finally, the Second Vatican Council involved an attempt by Catholic leaders to respond to a wide range of contemporary issues, challenges, and situations in their church and in the world. With regard to the Protestant Reformation, as I've tried to argue, the ability of ordinary people to participate in important historical events was always there, but has only perhaps recently been explored and a real effort made to understand it by historians. In the case of Vatican II, the ability of ordinary people to participate in the Church Council may have been limited. Yet the role of ordinary people to meet those challenges, address those issues, and enact changes, whether of the reform or revolutionary variety, remains open. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me be here. I have a weak voice today. I'm apologizing for that. I'm going to take you in a bit of a different direction for a moment, but I promise that I will come back to Reformation in a moment. I want to talk about cell phones for a moment. YouTube has a wonderful little clip regarding cell phones entitled, "If All Movies Had Cell Phones." It revisits many of our famous movies that many of us have watched, considering how the plot may not any longer exist or be considerably a different type of plot had there been cell phones. For example, Gilligan's Island, Home Alone, and all the other Home Alones after that. With Blair Witch Project, a movie I have not seen, but apparently you're just running through scary woods, not being able to get a hold of anybody. And some romantic ones, such as An Affair to Remember, where two lovers can never get together because they miss each other. What if they had had cell phones? Well, I was at a conference just last weekend in Denver where we were in different restaurants trying to get a hold of everybody, and when we finally converged, because everybody did have cell phones, the question was, what did we do before cell phones? I raise this just as an illustration to ask the question, what did we do before Vatican II? Because I think sometimes we can move into a religious terrain where we forget where our starting point was, and we only sort of remember where we are now. I can say that I didn't go through Vatican II. I was after that time. And in fact, when I talked to Jared about speaking tonight, I was a bit uncomfortable with the fact that I am not part of that generation. I wondered about that, and yet, as I started to think about the ripple effect and the impact of Vatican II, what I thought was very important was to see, not just myself, but other panelists, to discuss Vatican II from the point of view of not being in the tradition and not being in the generation, which I will give away, says to me that it wasn't Reformation. I want to talk about then putting in front of you some before and after pictures so that we can really kind of put into place what some things look like before and what some things look like after. I want to start by just saying a word about the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches was in its gestation stage of a consideration, starting to be a part of people's minds in the late 1930s, but becomes an official body in 1948. In 1948, the World Council of Churches sets out to really put in the global scene this idea that Christianity can speak to particularly the problems of World War II and other global issues. At the time in 1948, when it started, there were about 100 different denominations of different churches, but primarily it was Protestant, it was Eastern Orthodox, but it was not Roman Catholic. It was not until 1965, and after we start having the conversations of Vatican II, that we have had 40 years of the Roman Catholic Church engaged in the dialogue of the World Council of Churches. From a point of view of the United Methodist Church, that has been part of the World Council of Churches, it is somewhat staggering that we went through those early years where there was not the Roman Catholic involvement. Some of this, we could go in forever about the reasons for that, but some of it was simply that Catholicism had to work out who are they now in the world scene post-World War II, and how do they engage more than just themselves? How do we move into the world of other different traditions of Christianity? I don't come into the scene until the 1960s. And I recall that in a small college town that was 98% Protestant, that the ecumenical movement started to become alive. And while I didn't engage too much with Catholics, what I do recall is the Catholic priest in town that I never knew he had a name. I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did have a name, but I didn't know what his name was, except he was always referred to as the priest who will now speak to us. That's his name to me, still to this day, the priest who will now speak to us. Now, in the summertime, and I think this is worth looking at, in the summertime, we had ecumenical worship together. Literally, we didn't go to our own church except for maybe one time out of a rotation of 8. But what was more significant than the sharing of worship with other Protestant bodies was the priest who would now speak to us. And it was a celebration. I never recall it being something, now we can laugh at it and say that it was quite a dig. But at the time, as a child, I recall that as a real celebration that he was part of our community. I think that is where we start seeing this movement, an era of inclusion. If I can speak perhaps from the other side looking in, and for those of you who are in the Catholic tradition here, of being able to note historically a time and a place in which it changed how our community also interacted with that era of inclusion. Now to, if I can move about 20 years further, a great story that some of you've heard spoken not long ago in First United Methodist Church that I want to tell here. I attended Duke Divinity School, but for one semester I went to Wesley Theological Seminary that was in Washington, D.C. And while there, it was encouraged encouraged of the seminarians to take advantage of a theological consortium of different seminaries so that we could be a part of this bigger dialogue. And so many people did do that, and I chose to take a scripture class that was being offered at Catholic University. I went over the first day to Catholic U and was trying to find the building. And as I would run into someone, I could tell that when I would show them where I was supposed to go, they were a bit perplexed, but kept sending me on my way. I finally arrived at the building and checked in, and even the woman in the front kind of was a bit surprised, but told me how to get to the room. And her explanation was, well, you'll want to go up to the 3rd floor, and it'll be a very long hallway, and at the very long hallway, there'll be a classroom. And so I took her direction, knowing that something didn't seem right by all of this, and when I got to the 3rd floor, realized I was in a training center for priests, maybe a monastery, I'm not sure. It was a seminary, but I was going through all of their dorm rooms. The long hallway were dorm rooms to get to my classroom. I arrived at the classroom and it was full of male students. And at the time I was a very introverted person and didn't want to be there. And so I stood out in the hallway kind of trying to assess how to get out of this trap. And then the priest sees me and stops the class that's just starting and comes out to the hallway. He says to me, I am so glad you're here. You need to be here. It is important that you are here. I have just the seat for you. And brings me in and sits me right in the middle of the classroom. And now I really feel trapped. And so halfway through the class, when they are getting pretty deep into Greek, and I had not had Greek at the time, I'm feeling this is my way out. So after class, I go up to the priest and I say, I don't think this is going to work for me. I don't have any Greek. I'm going to be really lost. And he says, you know what? We're going to work on your terms of what you can do at your level. But it would be really important to me if you stayed. Because the thing is that we've really been trying hard to work on this relationship and this dialogue. And I think you're as important to us as we might be important to you. So if you would you please stay for my class? I point to the fact that was a very important class to me. He was fabulous in terms of his teaching, but it was much more than that. It was the ecumenical relationship that I found in establishing friendships with people going into the priesthood, other men who were not going into the priesthood but wanted to be professors of Scripture. This is tremendous for someone's learning who had come out of Missouri from a small town that was almost 100% Protestant. And I credit the consortium for seeing the value of putting that in seminary curriculum. Those are just a few glimpses of who I might be as a Protestant minister, but also having the value of those interactions. I will also just say a few things. Going back to Duke was also a time in which liberation theology was very strong, especially in our relationships with Guatemala and Nicaragua. As I went on a trip just to Mexico, I remember that The people who led us in that group were Marianal sisters. We worked with Liberation Theology while we were there. And so by the time seminary was over, the interactions and the crossover between different traditions was quite embedded and quite ingrained in myself. Just to say a word about today, in some ways I do miss ecumenical gatherings that I remember being a part of my childhood much more than I see today. I love events like this because it is that strength. But we do see ecumenical relationships breaking down in campus ministry and some other community contexts. But I would rest on the fact that we have seen a lot of progress in terms of social cooperation. Some of you I see from Catholic Charities, from other organizations where we have worked very hard with the fires in this community, where we have worked very hard on some issues of poverty, even though I'm still fairly new to this community, in other communities where it feels like we are a family when we work with some of those issues. I don't want to gloss that up too much. Certainly there's those issues that we need to overcome, but I maintain that we have come a long way, and that the priest who will talk to us is now nothing that I ever would even consider a barrier today. And if it is the case of that, it's the case of the individual, that would be just as much a Protestant issue as it would be a Catholic issue. So those are my comments. I think I couldn't be more excited that this is the topic. As I look at who I am as a Protestant minister, I value that much of that training and continuation of ministry continues in an ecumenical setting. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Pastor Aelabouni, as Jared mentioned, one of the pastors here at Trinity, so I can't pass up an opportunity to greet you also in the name of Trinity Lutheran Church and welcome you here for this event. There are many of us who have been so excited to prepare for this event, and I am very honored to have been asked to be a part of it. Now that it sounds too much probably like I'm one of those candidates at the beginning of the debate giving all of my thanks to everyone, I'll continue. I wanted to share just a little bit about my own faith and religious background, maybe to admit some of the bias that I have approaching the topic. I am born and raised as a Lutheran Christian. I was baptized a Lutheran in Salt Lake City, Utah. There are Lutherans there. And grew up very active in Lutheran congregations in Wyoming and in California, and attended for my undergraduate and then my seminary education Lutheran institutions as well. So I'm, by choice as well as by upbringing, a proud member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And I also have then in my background sort of some of the religious pluralism and multi-religious reality that I'm sure many of you live with, regardless of what your personal faith background or tradition may be. In fact, most of my immediate family is non-religious. Part of that group, the non-religiously affiliated group that the Barna Group and others have noted is growing in this country. And in my family, and we have also members of our family who've grown up Buddhist or Hindu, And in fact, my own marriage to Pastor Aelabouni, my co-pastor here at Trinity, though he is also a Lutheran pastor now, he was raised in the Melkite Church, which is a branch of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle East, and particularly the Holy Land, that still retains a lot of the liturgical identity of the Orthodox Church. So like many of you, I'm strongly one thing with a lot of other things mixed in. And I mention that as I go forward to say that I can't claim to speak for all Lutherans, for all Protestants, not even would I ever claim to speak for all of the members here at Trinity, but I will share some of my personal reflections on what being a part of a Protestant church and a pastor in a Protestant church after Vatican II has meant. I'll start with a story. I'd like you to picture with me, if you can. In 2007, I was present in Lund, Sweden, for the 60th anniversary of the Lutheran World Federation. The Lutheran World Federation is an international communion of Lutheran church bodies, like the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. There are about 145 Lutheran church bodies from 79 countries that now make up more than 70 million individual Lutherans worldwide. And this all started then 60-some years ago, shortly after the Second World War in Sweden. So we had gathered for an anniversary celebration, and the highlight was a communion service, a mass, Lutheran mass, in the Lutheran Cathedral in Lund. And where I was seated in the cathedral, there was a section of the cathedral where the pews pointed backwards. Seemed odd a little bit. So you're pointed at the front door. I suppose that's handy for some folks wanting to make a quick exit after communion. And even though I couldn't have the best viewing vantage point for the service, it was actually happening at the front of the cathedral, where all of the bishops and pastors were. I had a wonderful view of the astronomical clock that was built onto the back wall of the cathedral. I learned was actually built in the 1400s, so it was an ecumenical clock. It was Catholic before it became Lutheran. And it was one of those very, very old clocks that had wooden figures who, when the hours chimed, would come out, and there would be chimes, and then there would be sort of actions. Luckily, the sound had been turned off for the anniversary service, but not the actions. I will not tell you that I was more interested in the clock than the sermon. I will tell you that I don't remember the sermon, but I do remember the clock. Now, it happened that one of our special guests at the 60th anniversary of the Lutheran World Federation was Cardinal Walter Casper, who at that time was still the president of the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity, which had its origins, its birth, in the Second Vatican Council, and then evolved. Cardinal Casper was there as an honored guest with a letter from Pope Benedict of greeting to this international gathering of Lutherans, and of congratulations. Now the letter was both written and read in German. I know some German, but I am by no means fluent. But I did notice that while Cardinal Casper was reading this letter, and 80% of the congregation was very intently focused forward, listening and watching, those of us who were in the back noticed that the hour struck. And silently, the doors of the clock opened, and these two figures, two knights on horseback, came out and approached each other on a track. Because I knew enough German to get the gist of the letter, I happened to notice that Cardinal Casper came to a point of describing the very special relationship between Catholics and Lutherans, and wouldn't you know it, at that exact moment, the two knights on horseback raised their swords and started to silently bash I do not know if anyone else noticed the ironic timing, but that image came to me as I was preparing for this, because I thought, you know, there is a special relationship between Catholics and Protestants, particularly between Lutherans and Catholics, and maybe that's one way to characterize it. That on the one hand, who would one time that a cardinal from the Vatican would bring official warm greetings from the Pope to an international group of Lutherans, or that he would be let in the door and warmly welcomed and received as an honored guest, and yet in the back, here are two knights bashing each other with swords. It recalled to me a little bit of what Diane said in her presentation about the difference sometimes between events like the Reformation or Vatican II as experienced from, I'll call it the front of the cathedral, where the leaders and the high-level formal actions are taking place, and the back of the cathedral, which is where some of the ordinary folks, those who are in the pews or happen to just be members of these faith communities, are also receiving and experiencing these events. And I don't think that stopped, but certainly that's still sort of two different ways in which we can look at where these movements have brought us. So, speaking from a Lutheran perspective, from the front of the cathedral, the Second Vatican Council sparked and begun continuous, ongoing, positive, constructive dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and international Lutheran congregations and church bodies that in 1999, for example, led to a document that is really astounding, but not very many people may know about, the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, which was signed by representatives from the Vatican, also Cardinal Kasper, and representatives from the International Lutheran Community, Reverend Dr. Ishmael Nokro, who until recently was president, General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation. And it said, in essence, that we find we can come to enough agreements on the doctrine of justification that we can move forward in dialogue. In fact, some of the quotes, I had to look them up because I could hardly believe it, that it said in part that the understanding of the doctrine of justification set forth in this declaration shows that a consensus in basic truths of the doctrine of justification exists between Lutherans and Catholics. Now imagine that statement being made 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago. And then in fact, it went on to say that the teaching of the Lutheran churches presented in this declaration does not fall under the condemnations from the Council of Trent, and the condemnations in the Lutheran confessions do not apply to the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church presented in this declaration. Now this was not by any means a statement of total agreement about all of our doctrinal, theological, church policy issues, but considering that 500 years ago, Luther pointedly and repeatedly referred to the Pope as the Antichrist, this is movement forward. And as, yes, many Protestant churches and the Lutheran Church especially prepare to observe and commemorate the 500th anniversary of the posting of the 95 Theses as a point for the beginning of the Reformations. And I've noticed a change in language in some of those formal levels, from celebration to observation. The idea that we are not going to continue to celebrate the brokenness or separation of the Christian church, the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, but that will commemorate the ways in which, especially for Protestants, it birthed the traditions out of which we come and brought what many of us consider were much needed reforms within the Church Catholic. But then there's the back of the church. And in the back of the cathedral, among ordinary people, there is a wide variety of opinions and feelings and understandings. And that's, of course, where most of my personal experiences have been. Some very positive ones. When I studied in Germany while I was in seminary, I lived in an ecumenical international student house called the Collegium Ecumenicum that was sponsored by the Lutheran Church in Bavaria, which was is predominantly Roman Catholic part of Germany. We were Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox students together. We ate and worshipped together. We enjoyed joint speakers and took study trips, one to Poland and one to Strasbourg and Freiburg. And we had a wide variety of ecumenical experiences, everything from in Breslau, which is now Wrocław, Poland, seeing the church in which Dietrich Bonhoeffer was baptized, to visiting a paranormal research facility in Strasbourg, where we were all sort of equally aghast to hear about research being done into past life experiences by interviewing very, very young children in some countries. That was, I think, eye-opening for Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox alike. And yet in that same context, in one of my seminars, we were studying how the clergy were portrayed in film and television programs. And when we watched the movie Luther, made a few years ago with Joseph Viens, the German Protestant students were shocked to envision the character of Luther as a priest wearing white vestments and a green stole, which is what most all American Lutheran clergy wear. But to them, in Germany, the Protestant pastors still wear the black academic garb, the black talar with the white collar that was still kind of harks back to the time of the Reformation. So for them it was, why is Luther dressing so Catholic? And I will admit that I have experienced wide avenues of cooperation and love and close connection between Lutherans and Catholics, but still there's this, I'm going to use an academic word here, stickiness between our traditions, and on a personal level as well. So in my seminary training, I was a part of a clinical pastoral education group where we did clinical work as chaplains in the hospital and then had a close group processing together. Two of my classmates were Catholic, and with one of them, I developed a very, very close friendship. We just were so enamored of each other, politically, theologically, professionally. We didn't agree on a lot, but we talked about a lot of things and had a lot of affection for one another. But then one day, I asked him, I said, there's something that's been bothering me, and I have to talk to you about it, because I feel as though we've gotten to know each other so well, and it's that I can't stop thinking sometimes when we're having discussions as colleagues, training for the ordained ministry together, to wonder, do you consider my ordination valid? Would you consider me really a colleague in ordained ministry? And he said, I would love to tell you yes, because I hold you in high esteem, but I can't. The answer is no. So that stickiness still exists, I think, for us in ways that are still hard on both sides for us to figure out how to walk through. But I think that the hope that I see is found in the fact that thanks to the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and certainly movements in my own church tradition to try to recapture and recognize the one Holy Catholic Church, the importance of rediscovering the things that bind us together is the direction we're headed. The bishop of our national church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Mark Hansen, has started to say visibly, audibly, prominently in our church that he believes God is calling us as Lutherans toward defining ourselves on the basis of our commonality, what we share in common with one another, with other branches of the Christian church, and not defining ourselves against or setting ourselves apart by focusing on our disagreements. It's hard to do because those of us who are Protestants take our name from the idea of being protesters. And so there's a temptation to define ourselves based on whom we're not. Whether that's defining ourselves based on how we're not Catholic, or is more common, I think, today, mainstream Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike, defining ourselves based on how we are not like those fundamentalist, evangelical, non-denominational Christians in the world. So there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done. But my final idea or hope that I'll share also harks back to the time I spent at the Lutheran World Federation Council. One way, I think, to move forward is through repentance. I have, in my personal and pastoral life, seen unbelievably beautiful and amazing things come out of the reconciliation that begins with repentance. And in 2010, when I was at the Lutheran World Federation Assembly in Germany, one of our most powerful actions as an international body of about 1,000 Lutherans from every country you can think of was a carefully considered statement on which we voted to officially repent as a church for the persecution of Anabaptist Christians by Lutherans in particular, and others of the Reformation. Luther in particular was pernicious in his language about the Anabaptist movement, which has led to modern-day Amish, Mennonite, and other Anabaptist traditions. And our presider was Bishop Hansen, invited us to vote for this statement on our knees, which was quite a liturgical and religious thing to do in a pretty secular assembly hall at a convention center in Stuttgart. And many of us did get down onto our knees as we voted on this measure. And I remember thinking a little bit, again, coming from a period of the church, as Rebecca did, where so much of the ecumenical movement has gone before us that we sometimes don't realize it's there. I thought, does this really matter? It's been 500 years. Are people's memories really that long? Is it going to make a difference? Is it too little too late? But then I looked up as we were voting, and in the balcony of this convention center were hundreds of guests invited from the World Mennonite Council. And as we voted on this act of repentance, I saw people weeping openly, tears streaming down their faces, and I realized, yes, it does matter. It can matter. And as we finished that, the World Mennonite Council representative got up, and the first thing he said was, "We cannot come to this table free from guilt." And so they responded to our act of repentance by their own confession, and then presented us with a hand-carved wooden basin for foot washing, which is a significant liturgical action, I guess, in many Mennonite, many Anabaptist traditions. And it was made in one of the Pennsylvania Amish communities, not too far removed from the one in which the shooting occurred a number of years ago, when those Christians gave a powerful witness for our whole church to radical forgiveness. And we were presented with that foot basin, and then we shared a service in which we shared foot washing and communion, and I think a promise of what could lay before us as we move forward. My hope is that God will continue to break down the walls that divide us where they needn't, so that we can make a stronger, unified witness to a world in which, let's face it, Christianity and perhaps religion in general are more and more considered at best irrelevant, and at worst dangerous, as only being sources of conflict and division where our world so badly needs greater unity. That's my hope, and this event here is by no means a small sign of what may be possible. Thank you.
Good evening. In my long career, I don't think I've ever followed 3 women. It's sure different and very nice. Thank you, all 3 of you. It is a celebration of the Second Vatican Council. And I'll try to be brief. I just had sort of 3 questions that I'm dealing with as we go through this series. And I thank Diane for showing us the complexity and the many facets to the 16th century Reformations and the shift that there were some Catholic reformers also at that time. So the question I've had during this series is, was the Second Vatican Council a Reformation? Father O'Malley, who's the only one writing on these things right now, he studies the same period as Diane. He talks about 3 different kinds of Reformations. And so there's a reformation depending on who the authority is, from above or from below. And it was a surprise to me. I would have thought the Protestant Reformations were from below. But they were sort of the elites, I guess. You could talk about that more and enlighten me. But clearly, we'll come back to this in just a second. The Second Vatican Council, O'Malley ends his book saying it was called by, hosted by, controlled by, and in the end, to some extent, subverted by the center. But I'm giving you my answer too soon. There's a certain thing that can happen aside from changing structures, which O'Malley calls a system change, rather than just correcting abuses. There's another kind of reformation where you change a mindset and where you change values. And I think in terms of a change of mindset and a change of values, the Second Vatican Council was, in that sense, a reformatio, a really big system change. And a lot of you have heard this, and even John O'Malley must have thought this was one of his favorite passages because he quoted it. And I can't quote all of it, but in one of our small groups, we read the document on the liturgy. And the word change and progress and advance and renewal is just ubiquitous. And the changes proposed in that document were life-changing for Catholics, and for some extent for Protestants too, because we all sort of accepted the same reading list in the liturgy. But he says the language from previous councils to the Second Vatican Council shifted from laws to ideals, from commands to invitations, from definitions to mystery, from threats to persuasion, from coercion to conscience, from monologue to dialogue, from ruling to serving, from withdrawn to integrated, etc., etc. It goes on. And all of that is true of these documents. From that point of view, this was a profound mindset change, a profound change in values, a huge liberation, a huge openness to the world and to the Reformation churches and to world churches. They went so far as to say that one of the reasons for atheism in the modern world is Christians, because some Christians make God unbelievable. So it was a huge change. But it was not a structural change. And so why did Vatican II fail to change structures, the authority structures? I think that the reception of Vatican II, the people and the Protestant churches, some of the Protestant theologians were more celebratory of Vatican II than Catholic theologians. People were really excited by Vatican II, but not necessarily the popes, because it involved a change in the power structure. O'Malley said it was called by the center, hosted by the center, took place in the center, was controlled by the center, and then at the very end, the Pope put the reforms in charge of the Curia. It's like putting the hen house in charge of the fox. Putting the fox in charge of the hen house. So that's why I think, very, very, very briefly, I think the other thing is the church is so big. A billion? I don't know. It's huge. It's hard to move such a big organization. And you know, we think of the Protestant Reformation as fracturing. But I'm beginning to wonder if maybe you could call it, instead of fracturing, maybe we could call it regionalization. Another Jesuit theologian, Roger Haight, who wrote a book on comparative ecclesiologies, does a wonderful job describing the beauty of each of the major Reformation traditions. And his idea is that no one church can fully express the mystery that church is. And each of these churches has something marvelous to teach us about church. And it's not that I'm church and you're not, but what do you know about church that I don't know? What do I know that you don't know? And wouldn't we be a lot better off sharing that? So maybe regionalization isn't so bad. Some people think Roger Haight thinks that what happened at the Reformation, the 16th century Reformation, was the regionalization of the Catholic Church. And we have a word in the Catholic tradition going back beyond the Reformation called collegiality, which is that the bishops together lead the church with the Pope, some kind of a primacy, but not a primacy that cancels out the role of the bishops. The Second Vatican Council has beautiful language about the church as a community and how the leader of the community has the grace of state to speak for that community if the leader is listening to the community and discerning what the Holy Spirit is saying and doing within the community. Now, it's hard to do that if you're infallible. So, some people are saying maybe we need a third Vatican Council. I certainly wouldn't like a third Vatican Council. First of all, it's impossible. O'Malley shows how expensive it was, how big it was, and a lot of people say that the Second Vatican Council is a building in process, and they talk about when they wanted to build the new St. Peter's, they had to wait until the old building was torn down before they could build the new one. Now there's a parable for thought. Vatican II is an unfinished building, and maybe something has to come down. There was a Jewish Dept psychologist who taught me something that Jesus had said first. But he said, if something really new in your life is going to live, perhaps you should expect that first something old is going to have to die. So I think collegiality, what people are talking, Catholic theologians are talking about, not a world council, but synods. I guess I'm asking, and this may be heretical, so I'll throw it out. You guys have had experience with it, you Reformation people. What would be wrong with regionalization? What would be wrong with national synods, where the people elect the bishops as they did in the early church, and where the bishops elect a bishops' conference? Pope Benedict XVI, when he was in charge of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he emasculated bishops' conferences, saying, you can't do anything without our permission. You can't even create an English translation of the readings without our permission in Rome. So collegiality is a long thing, and it's always been in tension with the papacy. But the papacy didn't become infallible the way it is now until the 19th century. So revolution was in the air in the 16th century. And I loved reading about Erasmus. I didn't realize he was such a reformer, but he decided not to leave the church. Revolution is in the air right now. And Reformation, I hope it's not revolution. There were unintended consequences in the 16th century. I hope we don't have to wait for that. But Reformation is in the air, and we have it in our tradition. It's called collegiality. And the Pope and the conferences of bishops could be checks and balances. They could balance each other. That's what I'm taking from the Reformation, and is my hope. And I hate to throw a little piece of controversy into this wonderful evening, but I want to thank all three of my colleagues. I just really enjoyed what you had to say. And it really is a celebration of what Vatican II did accomplish. The spirit of Vatican II is alive. It's in our DNA. And the question is, how do we move forward? Can we do that peacefully and with love? Thank you.
Is this on now? Yeah. Thank you. That was just inspiring for me. And so I want to tell you how much I just enjoyed and hung on every word that each of the four of you spoke. But now it gets harder. I'd like to put the question to each of you. Was Vatican II a reformation, And I don't have a pre-planned order, so why don't we go in the order in which you each spoke. Tell us your thoughts on that, and then we'll open it up for comments from the audience.
Okay, let me begin by reminding you that, like my colleagues here, maybe not Joachim, but the others, I didn't participate in it. It happened in the past. But most of what I have learned about it has been in the context of listening to these comments and doing a little bit of reading outside. And it seems to me that if the definition of Reformation is a set of changes that are intended to preserve at the same time that they modify and improve, it sounds like it fits the definition. It also sounds as if perhaps the changes are not finished and the improvement is incomplete, but nobody said there had to be an end point. So that's my answer.
I would put it in the context of a Reformation. I would also put it in the context that a lot was happening in that time and place. It was the post-World War II, moving into the 60s, where so many things were going on, that there were a lot of reformations going on in all different levels of society, which is what is part of the reason for the need for it. But also, I guess it begs the question, particularly, so what would have happened if the Catholic Church hadn't gone in that direction? I think it would have really become irrelevant quickly to have not had Vatican II. It begs a second question, though, and I think it is that for me, Vatican II well excelled what it had to do if you're just looking at what it needed to do in the 1960s. I think it inspired. And again, I don't think it's finished, but it moved people, it inspired people. The ripple effect moved into all different pockets, not just the Catholic culture. And so for those reasons, I would say it kept to its identity in preserving itself, but it inspired itself to change also culturally.
I guess I can't resist first answering, because it's one of the maybe rare situations in which a child of a 500-year-old church can say to descendants of a 2,000-year-old church, "What's your hurry? Give it a little while. It's been 50 years, not 500. Who knows?" No, that's not my real answer. But Jared did ask me to be provocative, so. And in doing that, I'm going to do one of those things annoying English majors sometimes do and answer the question by breaking the rules and changing the question a bit. The question was Vatican II a Reformation? And I guess the question I find myself asking is Vatican II an ongoing Reformation? And even more importantly, maybe, will it be? And what will happen, not only in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in my church, in all of the branches of the Christian church throughout the world? What I'm waiting for and kind of hoping for is a reformation that doesn't happen only from each of our churches individually, and then how does that bring each of us together to the same table? But that if we're able to come to the same table, what is the reformation of the church that we will make together? And what will that mean for the identity and the witness of Christianity in the world in the years to come?
I guess I just add another thought in that there's a phrase called the emerging church or the emergent church, but it's understood differently by different people. Just as the Reformation, different people understood the word differently, what needed to be reformed and how to do it differently. Same thing with the emerging church movement, but what it means to some extent is that some people choose to go across the barriers of their traditions without leaving their traditions, but they find that they can do gospel work together, and that's where they put their energy. And the hope is that eventually traditional churches will lend ballast to that movement so that it just doesn't float off into the netherworld. But meanwhile, people are getting energy across. I mean, the context, you say you come from a biased perspective, I do too. And our biased perspective is that the leadership of our church is really turning back a lot of things, especially the liturgy, which is so symbolic of what we are. Some people think it's the most important document because it proposed such profound changes and authority. Those are causing a great deal of suffering and stress, and people are leaving in droves. So that we can't ignore that. But how do we deal with it without a revolution is my hope. I have no desire for a revolution. But I'd like to be like Erasmus, I guess.
And that makes me think a little bit too of this distinction that we raised between front and back of the cathedral. If there are cases in which the higher formal level relationships break down, there are, I think, equally cases of where the grassroots, community to community, clergy to clergy, member to member relationships and friendships are flourishing no matter what happens. And I've been thinking that regionalization that you were talking about that maybe happens with Reformation, we're going to see continue because where the printing press revolutionized communication at the time, we faced another revolution in terms of communication, in terms of the way we relate and connect to one another with the coming of the internet, social media. I was thinking of Diane's description of how you come to know what ordinary people experience of the Reformation through pamphlets and broadsheets, and I'm sure you might add plays and literature. And what do we see today but those same things, articles in magazines or television programs or movies, or the ways in which our popular culture weaves narratives together that speak between us about what we believe, and certainly people from all over the world can talk to each other one-to-one now. So it's interesting to see how that will affect things too.
I think patience is necessary. I was thinking maybe we all need to be 11 within our own church. We talk about the church being 11 in the world. Maybe the church needs 11 within the church.
And I think those last couple of comments about the importance of people in the pews, especially the back pews, is a good segue to the next part of our event tonight. I want to say thank you to all four of the panelists. As we were drawing this up on the board in a room back here a few weeks ago, we started contemplating the reality of how much we were trying to cram into one evening. And I want to thank them for all sticking to our schedule, because that's going to give us quite a bit of time to hear from all of you. The way I'd like to do this is, if you have a question or a comment, or want to respond to a comment that another person made, raise your hand, and if you think you have a loud voice and you want to try and stand up and shout it out, that's fine. But I can also walk up and down the halls, the rows here. I'll play Phil Donahue or Oprah Winfrey here and hand you the microphone if you want. And please feel free to make comments or to address questions to any of the panelists or all of them. Mary Jane, is your hand up there? Yes.
I was especially interested to see the references made to the advance of culture, the values of cultural development, and so on. And I'm reminded that we are living in this country under a slogan which has been evoked so many times, and which becomes more and more meaningful to some people and rather trite to others, and that is the concept of empowerment. Now, it seems to me within the heart of Reformation has always been the concept of increased empowerment on the part of the people, and that certainly began with the printing press and the efforts of Martin Luther. Now, where are we in regard to a realization of empowerment within not the structure, but within the breath of the Holy Spirit? be convinced that the Holy Spirit only spoke during Vatican II or Council of Trent, speaks only within the limitations of Italy or the German hierarchy. It speaks, the Holy Spirit speaks through all of us at all times. Therefore, it seems to me we must pray for the grace to be empowered within ourselves, to prevail upon the Spirit to in some way inspire us to remedy what needs to be remedied and to glory in what ought to be very proud. We ought to be very proud, whatever church we're a part of.
One concept I appreciate very much is Luther's concept of a priesthood of all Christians. And that the church, I remember that Yves Conrad was a great theologian in France who did a lot of work for Vatican II, wrote a book on the Reformation in the church, and said the Reformation always comes from the bottom and not from the top. And that's the way it is. And that is very excellent saying that we need to feel empowered because we are all sharing, all those baptized, sharing the common priesthood of the people.
Priesthood of the people, anybody?
I hear similar things in both of those comments, and I would agree. I think even as a minister, I struggle with my own denomination and decisions that feel institutional more than giving it out power, taking in power. I do feel empowered when we have discussions like this one. And I think the reason is because sometimes when we isolate ourselves in our own denominational issues, and I said this to the panel when we were working together, sometimes you can get wrapped up in your own denominational politics, and it can feel very isolating. And it has been my ecumenical friendships and colleagueships that have, in a way, allowed me to know that we all wrestle with those. And it also helps us have creative ways forward so that we don't just keep spinning in one little circle and not find that empowerment. So in some ways, for me to look at the Catholic Church, and one thing I value of the Catholic Church is sometimes I find Protestantism to be too individualistic. I really value the communal sense of Catholicism. When you can look over there, sometimes it helps you find the creative solutions you need for your own denomination. And we can work together by helping each other find those solutions.
Jared, if you could have people stand up, those that can or don't mind, that'd be helpful.
Oh, shut up.
Yeah, sorry, Cindy.
So John Lennon's words were running through my mind. Talk about revolution, we all want to change the world, right? And so my thoughts were running right along the same track as yours. Maybe revolution is more likely when we stay isolated within our own small denominations or faith communities. Maybe the challenge is to be that leaven within your community, working toward, toward that. Maybe it's the direction of the Spirit. So how do you deal with that tension? Because that's where that's where the danger opportunity is. The opportunity for real change and the danger of revolution. So how do you hang in there with that tension?
Well,
I don't know if you're asking any one of us. Or
Anybody.
one thought is, but it's hard to do, start out by friendship and conversation until you develop trust, and only then can you start dealing with the more difficult issues. The challenge is, what do you do in a system that doesn't communicate? That's really difficult. There is no way to communicate. I mean, I'll give you one example. Our staff spent weeks on a letter to the Archbishop years ago. The Archbishop gave it to a staff member to answer, who answered to the pastor. So, I mean, that's not communication. So it's hard to know how you deal with that. And maybe, so you do 11, but how long can everybody wait? I guess the grace of the moment is that we can accept one another in different communities. The other thing Roger Hay did in his History of the Church is, since the Reformation, we have to talk about the Christian community through history. He was going to write a Catholic ecclesiology and first did the history of the church. By the time he did the history of the church, including the Reformation, which he did in a very respectful, enthusiastic way, he decided he had to do a comparative ecclesiology, not reducing Christianity to the least common denominator, but holding up what was unique and valuable in each Christian tradition. And so that now we talk about the Christian community, a community of communities. And I think with the emerging church movement, there are people on the whole spectrum, from staying in the tradition to being in the middle without leaving. There are people who have to make choices all along, and maybe the grace of the moment is we can allow each other to make different choices. For some people, it's just no longer, it's like a marriage, it's just no longer life-giving. Other people still have the energy to stay and try and be 11 within their own community.
I've felt these past years that Vatican II's been in remission. The most influential years of my ministry, 35 years ago, were in participation with Roman Catholics in the Cursil movement. Roger Stefani, a union organizer, a Roman Catholic, dragged me to a Cursil meeting in which Catholic laypersons gave lectures along with Lutheran laypersons, and Monsignor Pfeffer and I served the elements to that gathering. That was the most impacting moment of my life, that we could join around the table. And about 5 years into that movement, in which we had this participation together, which I understand is a lay movement, the Catholics pulled out. And we had to organize our own Via de Cristo. And then comes the road to Emmaus. And then comes the Episcopals. And we all divided up into our own individual, just like denominations, into our own individual curseals. And I wonder, what happened? Boy, if that were to continue today, it would be something like this. This gives some hope of the reviving of that movement, which I think was so powerful in the reunion of the Catholic Church universally. Can anybody tell me what happened?
I had similar experiences. And my hope right now is that the spirit of Vatican II is still alive, and it will not be quenched. We're going through a difficult time, but that spirit has to just be expressed, nourished. But I had very similar experiences.
I would speak to that as well. I think what we're seeing are some, what I call identity wars, how to be more Methodist, how to be more Catholic, how to be more, I don't know if the Lutherans also are experiencing that. I heard Richard Rohr speak a year or so ago, and he cautioned that a lot of the identity wars are a defense against declining institutionalism. And that the more there's decline, there's more sense of, circling your wagons. And that has really been pretty strong in my mind as we've been working with some issues around campus ministry, but other issues where, while it is important that we have our own identity, it is also important that that doesn't become a trump card for pulling ourselves into these little enclaves where we no longer dialogue with each other. And I think that's good wisdom for all of us to be careful with those sort of what can become wars.
I'd just briefly add that I think I've seen this at least, or witnessed this. It's by no means the exclusive domain of the church or faith or Christianity, because it reminds me immediately of what's happening in our political processes here in this country. How different viewpoints politically have started to sever relationships, even very close personal relationships. And there's that sense of increased, greater and greater polarization. So with outside of the church, I guess I would say, as well as within. And so I'm a pastor, so my answer for that is sin. But beyond that, I mean, the same human brokenness that affects that splits us apart as people of faith also is splitting us apart as citizens of the same communities. So that's not a really helpful answer as to what could happen, but that's where I lay part of the blame, because I'm seeing it in so many contexts.
Can't resist this opportunity to put in a commercial here. Again, the E.J. Dion event that we're going to have on November 13th. E.J. has just completed a book called Our Divided Political Heart, in which he draws a lot of the parallels that Joachim and Meghan and Rebecca have been alluding to here, and he finds it in the secular world and in the religious world, and so I think he'll help us explore this some more. I want to ask Jim Reed if you would comment on this discussion about the way the church has turned inward on itself. And I know you've talked to a number of us about that's in some ways the opposite of what the church should be doing, that it should be reaching out across the margins, and you've talked to Linda Joyce and gotten some interesting genetic and ecological metaphors. Is that forefront enough in your mind that you'd be willing to share that with us? Okay, thanks.
This is from a conversation that some of us shared at the Trappist Monastery at St. Benedict's in June. We were having similar conversations, and among our group at that retreat was a scientist, a range scientist named Linda Joyce. And she said, there's an interesting thing in genetics that kind of sheds light on this, that in genetics you need a homogeneous center, but there's a lot of similarity, which is sort of an identity issue. But to maintain the health of the overall system, you also need the diversity of the periphery to maintain that energy, because the periphery is where the evolution is happening, the adaptation of the gene pool to the ongoing evolution of the whole environment, basically, is happening at that level. And so those people on the periphery are actually the geniuses who keep the whole thing going. So I think those of us who are on the periphery need to claim our identity as sort of that, the genius of that. And I was thinking John Courtney Murray was a hero of the Second Vatican Council. He's a good example of this, actually. He's a Jesuit American theologian. And in the 50s, he was condemned for his ideas on religious liberty, which grew out of the experience of the American church here. And he was silenced. He said he could no longer teach these ideas. But he still maintained the ideas, even though he wasn't allowed to teach them. And he was actually one of the 3 at the Second Vatican Council and was the primary author or instigator or inspirer of the document on religious liberty, which was one of the documents the Vatican crafted. And that wouldn't have happened if he had given up his periphery position, basically, because it actually ended up serving the center at some point also. So I think there's a sense of even if you're not in the homogeneous center, there's still huge value, and actually in some senses maybe more value on being sort of at the edge of the margin of the institution. Linda, present that sometime.
I really like that metaphor of a stable center and a innovative periphery, and that a healthy community lies in the relationship between the two, but not solely in either one of them by themselves. I think you've had your hand up for quite a long time. Let me hand the microphone to you.
I'd just like to say that my feeling is that it's really not a true Reformation. Reformation had its background in historically, there was the Catholic Church was not only a religious institution but a political. And as the Reformation started in the 1500s, it developed this political conflict that came forth with the religious conflict. Vatican II failed. It's a bringing the Catholic Church into the 20th century as the world had drastically changed after World War II. And now, without the political influence on the Catholic Church, the hierarchy has nobody else to appeal to, as it happened during the Reformation, whereas the leaders of the Reformation, the religious sects, could appeal to the political, and the political then got power and loyalty that way. Whereas the problem now within the Catholic Church, you have really no place to go because there's nobody to oppose the Pope and those immediately below him until the whole process of electing popes and those higher-ups gets changed. And that's why I don't think you can compare the two and say that Vatican II is a Reformation.
My friend Eric raised a very good question about what happened after Cursil. I also was alive during those particular times, and I will tell you, I woke up one day and we were in the midst of all of those wonderful good little things, and all of a sudden we had the charismatic movement. We also had non-denominationalism, and a big segment of our society could care less where we are in the Reformation or in the Second Vatican. They are doing it, and they really aren't concerned about a lot of the things that we're raising here, and that is a huge contention and a huge component of the history of Christianity.
I guess I would just say I probably need to enlarge my metaphor, right? Because we've been talking about the people in the front of the cathedral and the people in the back of the cathedral, and not at all about the people who never walked into the cathedral in the first place.
There's another hand over there.
I have a feeling that if we wait for hierarchical entities to recognize each other at this particular point, especially in the Catholic tradition, if we wait for that priest to say to you, I honor and recognize and celebrate your ordination and your gift that's been given to you, that you have claimed, and now by the acclamation of your community, you're going to actually grow into. If we wait for that, I think we're in trouble. And I think the people on the fringe are not only saying, I recognize I'm a Catholic woman, I recognize and celebrate your ordination, and can also have a colleague who is a Missouri Synod Lutheran. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. And he and I have an altar together in our office. Until we, in the back of the cathedral or outside of the cathedral or on the fringe, just start doing it anyway with each other. I just don't think we can wait for officialdom to bless what we are already doing here tonight.
Just to comment on that, E.J. Dion has a chapter in his book on populism, that most reforms started with populism. And politically, you have to give leaders ground cover, and when there's enough of a ground swell, then they have cover to do what they know is the right thing. So I guess the Spirit is alive, and we all have to fan it into flame. And the hope is that the Spirit is alive. The Spirit is alive here tonight. And the church is here in us.
We are sadly nearing the end of our evening, but I would like to take one more question if somebody has one that they'd like to ask John Paul.
It really is just a question. You spoke about the three of you did. Three of you spoke about the Vatican II being not part of your life space. I think it's obvious it was part of mine. I well remember pre-Vatican Church and the Vatican Council and the post-Vatican, and in some ways this is more difficult than it was for me, than it was when I was a boy. And I'm not sure, it may be because I had tasted what's possible and feel this pushback. Now my question is a pushback to be expected? Does a Reformation lead to a counter-Reformation? Do revolutions have counter-revolutions? And is this pushback of that sort? For one of the things you mentioned about the counter-Reformation, you didn't say that it stopped the value of the Reformation. That's my question.
And do Reformations automatically imply counters?
Well, let me say two things. First of all, one of the approaches that is now, I think, being practiced by historians to try to get at as full an understanding as possible of what happened is to look at these movements and actions and decisions in terms of interaction. And so not to see it as, well, I do this and then you do this and then I do this, but that some people, some groups may be working on similar problems, coming to similar conclusions, advocating similar reforms, but ending up in different places in the way that some Catholic reformers echoed the same criticisms that Martin Luther expressed, but were not willing to break away from the authority, traditions, and the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. The other thing I would say is that the one end point of the story that I outlined is that after all the conflict, after all the bloodshed, after all of the identity fighting in the 16th century, which could get pretty brutal, one of the endings that has been suggested to this story is that by the 18th century, people have said, enough. This is not what religion is about. If it's bloodshed and hatred, we're not going to do it. We're going to find other ways to explore and understand religion, and we're going to find other ways to understand the world, to improve the human condition, to improve society, to improve political institutions. And so so for some people, the end point of the story about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the way in which groups fought with each other and sometimes punished each other for their differences was a pathway that led to coexistence, toleration, and a moving away from using violence as the method to settle religious differences.
Meghan, did you have an announcement you wanted to make before we part?
I did. In maybe the spirit of continuing opportunities to gather ecumenically in this space, Trinity Lutheran does have an invitation for all of you. We are very privileged on Friday, December 7th, to welcome the Reverend Mitri Rahab to our community and our congregation. Pastor Mitri is pastor at Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, which, as many of you probably know, is in the Holy Land, in the West Bank in particular. He is a very prominent Christian Palestinian leader. There is in the Holy Land right now a lot of ecumenical cooperation among Palestinian Christians, and he will be coming to our congregation and some others in the Fort Collins area on Friday, December 7th. We're holding a concert, a musical concert called Instruments of Peace, that will highlight the work for peace that Mitri and other Christians are doing in the West Bank and Palestinian territories. There will be an evening of music. Pastor Mitri will be a keynote speaker, and we will take a free will offering, but that will go entirely to purchase musical instruments for Dar al-Kalama College, built recently in Bethlehem, as a way to give college students living in occupied Palestinian territories access to music, to beauty, to art, and to hope. So you are all more than welcome to join us on Friday, December 7th for that event.
By way of closing here, I'd like to ask each of you, Ruth? Okay.
As we all struggle through all of this, whether it's revolution, reformation, or whatever, someone last year gave me a comment that I think is comforting. And when I get stressed, I think about this. And he said, and I can say that in this group, look who we follow. He didn't have it easy.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening. I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to ask each one of you individually, what are you going to take home from tonight? As an individual, what are you going to take home? I think I'm going to take home the insight that the people in the back rows make history. As I was listening to the panelists, I was thinking about the last year of my own faith journey and the very unexpected and very difficult decisions I've had to make personally about hard questions like, who is my faith community? And what does it mean to follow Jesus Christ? And what is the best way to practice Christianity? And listening to the panelists tonight, it gave me new sense of importance of not only the questions that I asked, but all of us ask. And we've heard a lot of great stories tonight about a divinity student walking through the halls of a seminary dorm room, and about someone sitting in the back of the cathedral watching knights bash each other on the atomic clock. And what I was reminded of is that each of us has those personal faith stories. We practice our faith. It's not just about decrees and documents and councils, but each one of us on a daily basis has to make concrete decisions about how to put all of that into practice. And what I learned from Diane and her insights into what historians are telling us about the Reformation is that those decisions about practicing our faith are what are going to make the church 500 years from now. And so I hope all of us can leave tonight with a renewed sense of the importance of what each one of us does as individuals to practice our common Christian faith. Thank you, and once again, please join me in thanking the panel.